Okay, great. Then I'm very happy to introduce Margaret Gough, who's visiting us from the University of Laverne. Margaret received her PhD from the University of Michigan, where she trained in the Pop Study Center. She then did a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard before starting her current job. And Margaret has published widely. Her article in ASR won the ASA Family Section Award. And her topic generally looks at families and gender and inequality. In her recent work, which we're excited to hear about, looks at recessions and unemployment and the effects on health and time use. So welcome, Margaret. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for having me. So this is some work that I've just recently finished on how unemployment is related to time in housework and time in childcare. And it builds off some of my previous research, but it's also using some new data. And unfortunately, you don't get the full color thing here. This is supposed to be blue and gold. I'm an alumni of Berkeley, but it doesn't look that way on here. So.
It's about as blue and gold as
Okay.
Yes, we are.
So there's a pretty extensive literature for those who aren't aware about how paid labor is related to time in housework. It's been going since the 1980s in earnest. But there's not that much literature about how time in childcare is related to time in paid labor, even though time in childcare is obviously very intensive, just like housework. And part of the reason for this is that there's a lack of regularly collected data on time in childcare. So, for example, with housework, we have almost yearly data from like the panel study of income dynamics, for example, about how much time people spend in housework. But for childcare, over time, it's been collected maybe once a decade or so in different time use surveys. Until recently, we haven't had very good data available. But it's an important thing to think about because some of the recent research argues that the decisions people make about how to spend time in childcare and paid labor might be even more simultaneous than those related to housework and paid labor. And that makes identification a little bit difficult. The work I'm going to be showing today, though, is really sort of a more descriptive study since it's really the first estimates of this relationship. So what I'm doing is using data from the American Time Use Survey, and I'm looking at how paid labor is associated with time in housework and childcare. And the way that I'm trying to get at this relationship is by following some of the previous studies on housework that use involuntary unemployment to try and understand the sort of shock in paid labor time. So I've done a little bit of work on this using the PSID, and Berner and Hamermesh in economics have done some work on this for unpaid labor in the household during the recession with the time use data. And I'm going to benchmark against both of those studies to just give a sense of the comparison because we don't have previous estimates of this childcare relationship, so to be able to give a sense of how similar or different my results look to previous studies. I'm going to be paying special attention to gender differences in the relationships because there are significant differences, we know, in terms of housework. And I think these are the first nationally representative estimates of the relationship between unemployment and childcare time in the US today. So as I mentioned, it's important to think about how we spend our time in paid and unpaid labor. And one of the reasons that I think childcare is particularly important to think about is that childcare is very costly and it's very common to outsource it, right? So if you think about tasks that people outsource, Sullivan and Gershuni have argued recently that childcare is actually the most outsourced of all of our domestic labor tasks. And so if you have a real shock to income through unemployment, you might expect to see some really large changes in how people use their time. So there are three theoretical perspectives in housework that I'm going to extend to the childcare context here. And I'm going to give you a little theoretical background and the hypotheses for each of them. So the first theory is time availability theory. It's the most basic of the theories, really. Basically what it argues is that the person, so in a partnership, the person who spends less time in paid labor has more time available for unpaid labor, okay? So if you think about the sort of traditional breadwinner model where you have a breadwinner husband and a wife who either works part-time or doesn't work at all, time availability theory posits that the wife will do most or all of the unpaid labor in the household because she's not spending an equal number of hours in paid work, right? So if we extend this to childcare, it's very simple, right? Just the parent with more time available is going to spend more of the time in childcare. Yes?
You mentioned before something about decision-making and simultaneous, and this seems like it is a very clear ordering of decisions. First comes work, then second, okay.
So this theory, yes, is typically thought of in a more simultaneous way, right? You make work decisions first and then unpaid labor decisions, although in practice it's not necessarily that clear, right? So I mean, the reality in families is probably that these decisions are made more simultaneously, but the theory, yes, is sort of a causalary kind of thing. Yes, synchronous, yes.
And by unemployed, do you mean not in the labor force? I mean, are they still in the labor force and seeking work, or are they not all in the labor force?
The ones that I'm referring to as unemployed are seeking work.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're separate from the out of the labor force voluntarily group. Yeah. So this leads me to two basic hypotheses. To start, the first is that unemployed men and women will spend more time in housework than employed men and women simply because they have more time available for housework, and that unemployed fathers and mothers will spend more time in childcare than employed fathers and mothers, again, for the same reason, right? So this is a pretty straightforward theoretical approach. And there's a second piece, though. Yes?
Well, it seems to me your 1A and 1B are much stronger than the initial statement, which I think is very from the hunky, because just as Josh, people have been saying, that's very causality. I mean, you could say it's just from a cultural perspective, women feel like they're most responsible and they get jobs that allow them to take care of kids and so on and so forth. Whereas your A and B, I think, are much more powerful because you have what is almost certainly an exogenous shock, which is leading someone who's previously employed to now not be employed, and to be unemployed they have to be looking for work, and so that seems to me, I like 1A and 1B, I don't really like the
yeah, so I agree that these are stronger statements, and I guess this is just kind of how the literature has kind of discussed this idea. In my other paper on unemployment and housework, we basically argue that if you think that this stuff is true, then it should make sense that a person who's unemployed would do more work because they now have time available to do that work. And so they don't this maybe doesn't quite as directly follow from that. Yeah. There is a second piece to time availability, though, that's important to keep in mind, and that is that the time availability theory requires that there's a partner to share the tasks with, right? In the way that it's been discussed in the literature, because it's the comparison of the partner's time decides who does what, right? Not to say that you can't try and apply this theory to someone on their own, right? But the way that they talk about it in the literature is always about the partner who does more, the partner who does less in paid labor. So my argument then is that this implies that if this theory is true, then we should see smaller gaps in housework time between unemployed and employed people for single people versus partnered respondents, and similarly for childcare. Because the partnered respondents can be shifting labor between partners in the case of unemployment, whereas a single person is just dealing with their own time, right? So, in other words, an unemployed person can increase their time because they can increase their time in unpaid labor because they have more of it, but they could also have their spouse or partner saying, I think you have even more time than you think you have, And so you need to do even more than you think you need to do. Yes?
So here you're not considering the possibility that, so after school care, for instance, is paid for, and then the unemployed person will remove the kid from childcare to provide more directly? You're only looking at partners sharing?
So that's a possibility, and that's going to come up in the second theoretical argument here, which is about resources. So there are two variants of the resource theory. One is the bargaining theory, and one is the autonomy theory. So the bargaining, again, is a partner-based model. The partner who has more resources compared to the other one, whether it's income they provide to the household, whether it's education, something like that, is going to bargain out of housework. Okay, so they're going to say, I bring in more income, I don't like housework, you don't bring in as much income, you have to do more housework. This is kind of the basic variant of the bargaining theory. Extending this to childcare is not quite as clear because it's not totally clear that parents want to bargain out of taking care of their children, right? Routine childcare maybe, like bathing kids and feeding them, that's sort of mundane, and a lot of parents maybe don't really want to spend a whole lot of time in that. But bargaining out of like playing with your kids is not really something that we see in the literature, right? So it's unclear that bargaining applies as much for childcare. The second variant here is the autonomy theory, which argues that, and this can be for single people or partnered people, that the individual uses their own earnings to either purchase substitutes for their unpaid labor. So if you think about like restaurant meals, for example, or they just use the amount that they're bringing in to sort of forego housework. Like they basically just decide, the house doesn't have to be as clean, my time is more valuable in the labor market, and so I'm going to spend more time working and not as much time cleaning the house. So if you extend the autonomy theory to childcare, then you can think about how parents use earnings potentially to buy childcare, right? And so if they're resource constrained, they might reduce their time, or they might reduce the amount that they pay for childcare by, for example, taking their kid out of childcare. So 3 of the hypotheses here are about bargaining and 1 is about autonomy. So first, I'm arguing that if bargaining is true, we should see that the magnitudes of the gaps between unemployed parents and employed parents are going to be larger for childcare than for housework. Second,
Isn't it the reverse?
Yeah, why would that?
uh,
I thought there was less motive to bargain out of childcare than to bargain out of housework.
So what, I might have written this wrong, but what I mean is that, yes, so right, so exactly. So people are unlikely to want to bargain out of childcare as much, right? But so as a result, we may not see as much of a change well, I'm not looking at changes here, but we might not see as much of a difference between how much parents are doing when they're employed or not if bargaining isn't an issue. Does that make
So the
sense?
magnitude will be larger, the unemployed versus employed difference will be larger for housework than for
Yeah,
childcare.
yes, right. That's what I meant. That might not be what this says, but that's what I meant, yes. So we also would expect that if bargaining is in effect, we should see bigger differences for routine childcare than for educational or play-based childcare, right? Because the routine childcare is the stuff people might want to bargain out of. And that the day of the week is not going to matter, and that may seem like it comes out of nowhere, but the thing is that if you're bargaining for a specific division of labor across time, right, we should expect that it's not so much about the time that you have available as it is the resources that you're bargaining with. And so whether it's a weekend or a weekday shouldn't be making a lot of difference here, if it's really about the resources and not about the time. And then for autonomy, we're just arguing here that the partnership status shouldn't matter if it's about autonomy, right? Because whether you're single or whether you're partnered, you can use your resources or not to purchase substitutes. Yes.
So I have a sort of question about the single person,
Yeah.
which sort of speaks to this sort of habit formation and skill. And so that is to say that if I'm in a two-parent family where both people are working and both people are doing some childcare, then sure, one person gets unemployed, they sort of have the skills to do more of that childcare in theory. But if you have a two-parent family where one person is working and one person is working much less, maybe the one does very little childcare, and even if that person loses their job, are not really equipped to step in. Family dynamics are not such that, okay, we'll just pick that up. Whereas in a single-parent family, you're necessarily probably doing some childcare. So I wonder how that sort of habit and skill for childcare fits into this. I guess it's the same for housework, but maybe standards are lower.
Yeah, so I think this is, so one thing to point out is that in these, just in these data at least, even employed people, like dads are spending quite a bit of time in childcare. So you don't see that much of like dads who don't really do anything, even in the routine childcare. But I mean, skill certainly plays a role. I think that the skill argument is a reason that we might expect to see coefficients that are smaller than we might expect. So for example, you now have 40 hours a week that you could spend on work, and we see that you only increase your time in unpaid labor by like an hour and a half. Because maybe you don't have a whole lot of skill, and so your spouse is saying,
Let's just keep the kid in daycare.
let's just, exactly, let's keep the kid in daycare, right? At least until you can't afford it anymore, right? Yeah.
Along those lines, do you factor in unemployment benefits?
I can't factor that in these data, yeah. And I don't have anything at this point about the length of the unemployment spell either, so. In some of my previous work, the length of the unemployment spell does seem to play a role. So the longer people are unemployed, they do make more shifts toward a more equal division of labor. Okay, so the resource-based and time availability theories are gender-neutral theories. It doesn't matter about the gender of the person who has more or less resources and time. So the literature has argued that we also need to think about gender, obviously, because time in housework is normative for women, but not really for men. And full-time paid labor is very normative for men, although it's become increasingly normative for women over time. So traditionally, childcare was also considered the purview of women. But there's this new father norm in the literature that people talk about having developed in the past 3 or 4 decades, where basically fathers are supposed to be more involved in a daily basis with the care of their children, including the mundane, routine kinds of childcare, and that they should be like really involved with their children's daily lives. So it might be the case that a father who is trying to be like this sort of new father who's involved, loses his job and kind of amps that up, right? Or it could be that the traditional gender norms kind of win out, and the fact that he's lost his job and is no longer a breadwinner, leads him to kind of push away things that he feels are sort of feminized tasks. So here, I'm going to argue that the time use gaps should be larger for women than for men, just because housework and childcare are more normative for women. And in past research, I've shown that women do increase their time in housework much more than men when they're unemployed, although both do increase. Second, that if the new father norm is in play, we should see a bigger gap between unemployed and employed men for childcare than we would for housework, right? Because housework is still not particularly normative, But the new father role would be something that if you're really buying into that, you would take advantage of this extra time you have to spend more time with your kids. Thirdly, breaking down the tasks here into female-typed housework tasks and time and housework plus male-typed like maintenance tasks, which I can describe more in a few minutes. That the time use gaps for men are going to be smaller for these female-type tasks, just because they are less normative than for the maintenance type tasks. But for women, that these will basically be the same, because women are not really expected by society to do all of the outside maintenance, right? Like the exterior maintenance of the house and mowing the lawn and all those kinds of things, vehicle maintenance. So there's not really any research looking at unemployment and childcare time. There are a few studies that have looked at how unemployment is related to housework. Shamir used data from Israel to show that the share of housework shifts in the direction of the unemployed person during unemployment, but then once that person's reemployed, it shifts back to the way it was before. Strum shows a similar thing with Swedish data. Berta and Hamermesh used the data that I'm using today and found that unemployed people were spending about 10.5 hours more per week in unpaid labor when they were unemployed. But their time use measure does include like every kind of thing that you would do in the house. So it's not just housework, but it's also care of children, care of adults, and a variety of other sorts of things that we don't typically think of in the housework literature. And then Sasha Kilowald and I have a paper where we use the PSID and fixed effects models to show that transitioning into unemployment is associated with a subsequent increase in time spent in housework for both men and women. But the increase for women is about twice the size as the increase for men. So there is research, though, about how the economy sort of is related to time and childcare, particularly for fathers. So Casper has this paper where she shows that during the recession of the late 80s and early 90s, there were actually more fathers caring for children and less children enrolled in childcare than in other periods, suggesting that the economy was probably playing a role here in terms of fathers being more likely in this recession to be unemployed or have only part-time work than mothers. The new father role, we know, is not being realized to the extent that researchers originally thought, like in the early 90s it was. So there's some research by Young et al. And Hook and Wolf showing that basically dads are spending more time in childcare than they used to, but it's mostly on weekends. And their argument is that this is probably because during the week dads are just too busy with paid labor. And so they've kind of increased their time on the weekends when they have time available. And so if we really think that it's about this time availability kind of argument, then we would expect that we'd see employed fathers spending more time in childcare on weekends. And that the gap between the employed and unemployed fathers would be smaller on weekends than on weekdays, because the unemployed dads have extra time on weekdays to spend more time in childcare, and the employed dads are spending more time than they do during the week on the weekends. And given that the majority of moms work, we can hypothesize the same thing happens for mothers, but there's no literature on this at this point. Yes?
And to clarify, is this childcare with both parents, or is it only the father when you consider time spent?
So I don't have a breakdown of that here. So some of it,
weekends it could be both.
It could be both parents. Yeah. Okay. So the data come from the American Time Use Survey, 2003 to 2013. It's all the years that I had available. It's a nationally representative time diary study. I extract the data from HSX, which is a product of Minnesota and Maryland, if you want to use time use data, it's way better to extract the data from them than it is to try and get it yourself. There are some advantages compared to other data sets we typically use to study housework. So typically the housework literature uses the National Survey of Families and Households or the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. Compared to NSFH, this is a really recent data set. NSFH is pretty old now. It's like late 80s, early 90s. PSID has a bunch of recent years, but the sample size is a lot smaller, as you'll see in a minute. I have really detailed time diary data, so people are filling out this diary for 24 hours of their day. And so I can look not only at time spent in childcare, which I can't get in other data sets, but I can also separate out female-typed housework tasks and male-typed maintenance tasks and look at differences there. And also, one of the kind of unique things about this data set is it also has time in secondary childcare. And secondary childcare is the kind of childcare that you do when you're doing another thing also. So basically, if you think about like you're cooking dinner and your kid is sitting at the table doing their homework, right? Your primary activity there is you're cooking dinner, but your secondary activity is that you're like kind of watching your kid who's doing homework, right? And so parents do a lot of secondary childcare. And so we can take a look at that. It's the only secondary activity that we have in these data. You can't really look at multitasking for other kinds of things, yes.
So if I'm downstairs on my laptop and the kids are upstairs on their laptop, is that secondary childcare? Or only if I say it is, or I mean, how
if your kid is under the age of, I think it's 12, then yes, the time use survey would count that potentially.
would I have to volunteer it, or would
you would, yeah. I mean, you would fill it out saying that like you were like looking after your kids basically, and then that your kids are, you know, they ask you, I think, about the age of the kids,
But if there's no kind of who else is present in the household, I would have to volunteer and say, oh yes.
yes.
The fact that I'm home with my kids means that I'm looking after them.
Exactly.
But they do collect who is present in the room with you during the activity.
Yes, they do have data on who's present in the room with you, but not like the household overall. So yeah, so it's self-reported. So you could say like, I'm doing all this stuff with my kid, but since we don't have data from both partners, we don't know if actually it's really probably your partner who's doing all the work.
But this point about the room, if the person's in the room with you, then it's very likely that you'll be counted as at least secondary childcare, or do you have to even volunteer that they're in the... I'm just trying to get the sense of how much differential reporting is going to be explained.
But were you doing any childcare at the time you were doing that?
Yeah,
And
it's
then if you
basically...
say
Is the
yes.
person in your room? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think it's mechanically inferred from co-presence.
No,
But I'm
no.
sort of asking if were you also doing
it's
some
asking,
childcare?
yeah.
You're like, yeah, I was.
Yeah,
But
they
it's
do
prompted.
ask you.
It's not voluntary.
Yeah.
It's prompted, I think.
Right, yes.
So I'm not very familiar with this time use survey. Do you sample every adult in the household, or is the unit, the primary sampling unit, the household, or is it an individual within the household?
No, so the household is in the current population survey, and then the sample comes from the outgoing rotation, and they sample one adult in the household.
Okay, and they sample, what is this for 24-hour?
Right, so once the person is chosen to be in the study and they agree to be in it, then they write their time diary for 24 hours, from 4 a.m. to 4 a.m. for like a specific day that they're given. So it can be a weekend day or a weekday. And what they write down is in, I think it's 20-minute intervals, maybe it's 10-minute intervals, at like what they're doing at that time. They're like putting down different activities. So they're saying like from, 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. I was sleeping. But from 6 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. I was like, running outdoors or something. That kind of thing. And then it's all like harmonized up by Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census Bureau to be in particular categories.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So we do only have one person from each household. I limit the sample to people 18 to 65 who are not retired or disabled at the last CPS interview. so that they have the possibility of being unemployed at the time use interview. The time that goes between the last current population survey interview and the time use interview is anywhere between 2 and 5 months. So it can be a little ways out, but we do have characteristics linked in from their last CPS interview, and then they've also been asked some of the same things at the time use interview. And the childcare analyses are limited to people who have at least one kid under 18 in the house. So I have about 102,000 respondents. So if we compare that to like the PSID where you might have like 5,000 people, this is pretty huge, which gives you way more people who might be unemployed that you can estimate a model with.
Margaret, can
Yes.
you give any empirical leverage after the fact that the price of childcare changes so much across children's ages?
Probably. I probably could because I do have the ages of the kids, but I haven't done that yet. Yeah. Okay. So I use, since this is pretty basic analysis to start, I'm using ordinary least squares models with the sampling weights and the replicate weights. The time use survey comes with replicate weights that you're supposed to use for most of your analyses if your analysis will support them, so I go ahead and use them. I do some propensity score based methods, and I can talk a little about that later, but the results were essentially identical, and because they were so similar, and this is kind of a first set of estimates on this topic, I went ahead and went with the more straightforward estimates. I estimate models generally separately for men and women, and then to test magnitudes of differences, I'm using seemingly unrelated estimation and walled tests mostly, and I do some sensitivity analyses, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So there are 4 dependent variables, time and housework. So time and housework is the sort of typical female type tasks like cooking, cleaning, interior household care kinds of tasks. I have a list at the end if anyone wants to see them during the Q&A. Then I have time and housework plus time and household maintenance. So that takes 1 and it adds in things like lawn and garden care, vehicle maintenance, those kinds of things, the more male typed tasks. I have time and primary child care. This is the stuff where like that's what you're doing as your primary thing. Like you're feeding your kid, you're bathing your kid, you're driving your kid to school, those kinds of things. And then there's time in secondary child care, which I already explained when you're in the respondent's care, but the child is not like your primary activity. The key independent variable is being involuntarily unemployed at the time of the interview. And as I mentioned before, this means that you're actively looking for work. I do also account for whether the respondent is voluntarily out of the labor force, and to try and somehow bring in a little bit about their spouse or partner's characteristics, I account for whether the respondent's partner is working at the time of the interview. So the time use survey, unfortunately, doesn't ask as much about the employment of the partner. It basically says, like, are they working or are they not working? Which means that for women, their partner's response, if it's not working, you can be pretty certain it's probably unemployed and not out of the labor force, although you can't guarantee it. But when we're talking about men's partners, who are in this data set almost entirely women, not working probably means a lot of them are out of the labor force and some of them are unemployed. And so we don't know exactly. Okay. Okay. So I control for a lot of things, and we can talk about those in the question and answer if you have questions about that. The basic model, I'm not going to be talking about model 1, it's just a reduced form model first. Then model 2 accounts for all the controls, and model 3 has an interaction between unemployment and whether it's a weekday or a weekend to test some of those hypotheses I showed before. Some descriptive statistics here. Basically, there's quite a bit of, these are weighted, there's quite a bit of racial ethnic diversity and education diversity in the sample. And you can see time over here. the averages in the data set. So about 78 minutes a day on housework, about 95 minutes a day on housework plus maintenance, a little over an hour a day on primary childcare, and then about 250 minutes on secondary childcare. Okay, so the results I'm giving you by hypotheses, and I'm going to talk about how they relate to the theory. So if we recall, the first two hypotheses, 1A and 1B, were about time availability, right? And so what we see is that, in fact, unemployed men and women do spend more time in housework and housework plus maintenance than employed men and women. And we see this is also true for primary and secondary childcare. Okay? So these results support what we would think from time availability theory. And if you benchmark them against the Berta and Hamermesh results and the results from my previous study, they're pretty similar. The Berta and Hamermesh results are about 90 minutes a day, but remember that includes the childcare also. So if you add up like the time in housework and childcare, and you average across men and women, you get a fairly similar result. And then the third hypothesis was looking at whether or not basically there's a bigger gap, right, for housework plus maintenance than housework for men compared to women, and we do see that. So this is consistent with the idea that maintenance is more of a male-typed task, right? Yes?
What are the people doing, not this, when they're unemployed, that's not this?
Sleeping as well.
I haven't actually gone through a lot of that yet, but yeah, sleep is actually one of them. Some people do spend, in other work I'm doing on health, some people are spending somewhat more time in physical activity.
Job search, a little
But
bit.
then also, yeah, there's job search stuff, and there's also like there is some watching TV and stuff, right? Leisure in general does go up during unemployment. Yes?
And you didn't have it in your hypotheses, but it would seem natural to look for cross effects. So if the father is unemployed, does the mother do less childcare?
Yeah, and so because it's hard for me to figure that, so.
Oh, you only have one for
Yeah.
each household?
Now I did test with the fathers who are not working and the mothers to see if the mother's housework or childcare is lower, assuming that the fathers who aren't working are probably mostly unemployed, and that is the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so in C and D, I was trying to look at whether or not there was time or bargaining going on here, and I hypothesized that the gaps would be smaller for single versus partnered people because single people can't be there's no shifting to go on. In fact, I find no statistically significant difference for housework, and I find actually the opposite of what I hypothesized here for childcare. So unemployed single parents actually spend more time per day in childcare than employed single parents. But this is much less the case for the partnered parents.
And this is,
Yeah.
And this is essentially comparing women. I mean, you don't have many single fathers in the ATTIS data, right?
I have enough that I can look at, but yes, the majority of this is going to be single moms. But you can separate them out, the single dads. Yeah. So the single people here doing more, which might be consistent with this idea, right, that if you're really resource constrained, you might take your kids out of after-school care, for example. This is a lot on this slide, sorry about that. But 1A, B, and D were looking at bargaining, right, and C was looking at autonomy. So what we see is that the gap in primary childcare is smaller than the gap in housework and housework plus maintenance. So that goes against what we were expecting, right? If childcare is not something that you want to bargain out of, we might expect to see more of this during unemployment, more childcare, and we're not really seeing a bigger gap. For routine childcare, we see significant differences for mothers statistically, but substantively, it's about 1 minute. So like, we're really not seeing anything huge here. For dads, it's not statistically significant, but we see bigger differences substantively. Then the day of the week thing, unemployed people spend more time in housework on weekdays. So that would suggest that maybe it's not so much about bargaining, but more about just time. For childcare, there's a gender difference, and I'm going to talk more about this in a second. But fathers spend more time on childcare on weekdays when they're unemployed, and mothers spend more time on weekends when they're unemployed. So, as you can probably gather, we're not seeing much evidence here for bargaining theory. In terms of the gender differences here, right? The housework plus maintenance gaps and childcare we said would be larger for women than for men. What we see is that the gender gap for housework is significant, but not when you add in maintenance and not for childcare. And I'm going to show you the graph on the next slide of this. And we don't see that there's a smaller gap for housework or childcare. So this is the picture. So this is the household labor, unemployed men in dark, unemployed women in the lighter color. And then down here we have the three kinds, but this is all limited to parents, and unemployed fathers are dark and mothers are light.
This is the absolute amount of time or the additional time versus employed?
This is the additional time, yeah. So what we're seeing is that for all men and women, whether or not they have children, we do see some gaps here, right, for housework and housework plus maintenance, but this gap is small. And then down with parents, we see a similar thing here. You look at primary childcare, and there's no real difference. Yeah.
So I mean, that's a large absolute minute gap, but in terms of closing the proportional gap, I mean, do we care about the minutes, or do we care about how it is the gap should be? In other words, men do just 35 minutes more as compared to women doing 55 minutes more, but maybe that leaves since women do much more housework as a baseline than men, do we care about the proportional change, or do we have the absolute minutes?
I mean, I think they're both important. I think the point that I want to show here is that once you account for these maintenance tasks, right, it's a much more similar amount of time that men and women are putting in excess, right? So admittedly, maintenance tasks are not kind of the routine sorts of things, and they may not get done all the time, but you are seeing more similar numbers when you account for that.
And even adding maintenance, men are still doing less housework on average, absolutely, and so in some ways,
yes,
differential experience of unemployment serve to close the gap.
That's true, yes, yes. Okay, so then the last hypotheses, we're just looking at whether or not this is about like not having enough time during the week to spend time with your kids, right? So employed fathers do spend more time in childcare on weekends. And so as a result, the gap in time between unemployed and employed fathers is smaller on weekends than on weekdays. It's about 3 minutes on weekends and about 32 minutes on weekdays. So the unemployed dads are spending more time in childcare during the week. But we don't see this for moms. In fact, we see the opposite. So we see that unemployed moms spend about 25 more minutes a day on weekends in childcare than employed moms. But it's like the same amount for weekdays. And so my explanation for this is probably that moms are maxed out on childcare during the week because they end up doing most of the childcare during the week. And if you look at the kind of childcare that this extra 25 minutes is, it's mostly educational and play-related childcare. So moms spending more time playing with their kids on the weekends when they're unemployed. Another possible explanation here is that if moms were doing a lot of their housework tasks on weekends, which prohibited them from playing with the kids, and they shift those tasks to days of the week, right, because they're now unemployed during the week, that frees up time for them to do more fun stuff with the kids on weekends. The results are robust across the
Sorry. Did you look at differences between those with school-age children versus under school age?
I looked at like under 5 versus higher than 5,
Yeah.
and the differences were pretty similar. Looking at younger kids didn't really explain much more, but I just tried separating the age of the kids.
Yeah.
So yeah. So across subgroups, the results are robust across racial and ethnic subgroups, education subgroups. Like I said, the models using the propensity score-based methods are very consistent with the OLS methods. You get estimates of about 30-ish minutes, right, for both men. For men in housework, if they're unemployed, whether it's the OLS model or the propensity score-based model. But there are definitely limitations, right? So the data are cross-sectional, which means that I can't be sure that there's not reverse causality going on. I can't be certain that you didn't up your time in childcare and subsequently lose your job because you're not putting in enough effort anymore. I've combined a lot of elements of housework and childcare to provide a broader picture, but of course there's a lot of detail in this data set that we could look at in subsequent analyses. And I can't really examine the division of housework and childcare from the dyadic perspective, right? Because I have very limited data on the spouse or partner, and I have no time use data from the spouse or partner. So that really limits how much I can do with the analysis. So, am I out of time now?
Oh, so last time for questions, yeah.
Okay, so anyway, time availability generally supported, resource theories not really, some support for doing gender for housework, but not housework plus maintenance, and mothers and fathers allocate time differently to childcare. So my argument is that some future research needs to look more closely at routine childcare separately from other kinds, and also that when researchers design new longitudinal surveys that are going to include questions about what you do with your time, they should ask a question about how much time people spend in childcare and not just how much time do you spend in housework. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I was going to ask, do you have sort of a normative sense of, so are recessions good for any reason? You know, so there's this literature that says, well, in fact, we end up healthier on average as long as we don't lose our job, or something kind of like that. Now here, we might not really know what the net inputs to the children actually are doing because we don't see the time diary of the kids maybe, but you could say something maybe about the parents. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, so so this study actually kind of came about because I was trying to look at health using the time use data and some of the things that might be related to individual health and low-income mothers' risk of obesity based on how they spend their time. And so that's something that I'm thinking about, but I haven't been able to look at yet. But yeah, I mean, because there's a lot of disagreement about whether recessions are good or bad for health, and whether or not, and so we could think about what kids' outcomes would look like, right? If this extra childcare is like kind of just a shifting, right, from parent to parent, then maybe there's not much benefit to the kid. But like these moms who are spending a bunch of extra time in play and stuff on weekends, maybe the kids are getting a lot out of that, right, which we don't know. And so that could be something that, if we could find good data, we could look at. Yes?
Do you have any measures on if the younger kids are in childcare outside the home?
I don't have anything about whether or not they use childcare at all.
When they're being driven from place to place?
I'm not sure that I have it. It might be possible to look at that, but I think it's just like, is the kid being driven to school or daycare or something like that? So you might be able to kind of break it down a little bit based on age, but once you're into those like 3, 4, 5 ages, it's hard to know if it's preschool or daycare or what exactly, right? But yeah, you could probably look at that, yes. Mm-hmm.
So you broke these up by childcare versus housework.
Yeah.
But I'm sort of wondering, is there like sort of a pot of non-work time that a parent would have that they could say, well, I can put off mopping the floor, but I still have to feed my kid who's a lot louder about it. Like where is, like, is is there a trade-off, not just between work and non-work, but between doing housework versus childcare?
I'm almost certain that there is, yes, and this is not something that I've looked at. But the timing issues, the like when things have to happen, are a lot more stringent for childcare than for housework, right? You can mop the floor in the middle of the night. You can't feed your kid dinner at 2 a.m. Probably, right? Well, okay, like you're not an infant perhaps, right? So I do think there are probably more constraints on when the childcare has to happen. I just haven't looked into the sort of time of day stuff at this point yet. And like I said, there's just not that much literature on this, which is kind of makes it a little bit hard. Yeah.
So it seemed like the literature that I thought of was the Bianchi stuff from her presidential PAA address, where she sort of has a surprising puzzle that mothers went to work, but children didn't get less time.
Yeah.
And that's not unemployment, but it is work and childcare, and that's a different story. Well, I don't know, you tell me if it's a different story, but it seemed like her story was, well, we thought that would reduce childcare time, and it just didn't, because in fact, kids aren't around as much as we think, and dads did more, and moms made it work.
No, that's true. So dads were doing some more, right? But also one of her arguments is that a lot of the time that moms, especially with school-age kids, a lot of the times that moms were spending during the day at home was not with the kids because the kids were in school.
Yeah.
And so if they're only doing the work in the like 5 p.m. plus hours, then having a job from 9 to 5 maybe doesn't matter.
But here it does matter, right?
It does, but if you look at the amount, it's still like not huge, right? I mean, 25 minutes is the biggest estimate here, right, for moms.
So in that sense, maybe it's consistent.
So maybe, yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's for sure inconsistent, at least, yeah.
I mean, a quick comment on magnitude is just that I think when we think about the minutes in a week, sometimes 25 minutes doesn't seem like a lot, but the number of absolute minutes that one spends with one's kid in the waking hours can actually be quite small.
Mm-hmm.
So 25 minutes, if you see your kid for an hour and a half a day, is pretty substantial.
That's true.
I guess I would just, a slight comment on that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I wonder if there is a shift in the share of total childcare time between primary and secondary.
Mm-hmm.
Whether, I guess whether secondary goes up.
So secondary does go up, but I haven't looked to see whether or not like the share changes.
Yeah.
So I haven't looked at that, but secondary does go up also.
It goes up when?
During unemployed parents do more secondary child care than employed parents, and they do more primary care.
Okay.
But there could be a share difference, and I haven't looked at that. Yeah.
So this sort of speaks to the 25 minutes thing, but I wonder if there's a way to sort of you've got the sort of average minutes of unemployment, and I wonder if what we're picking up there are two very different sets of experiences. One where you keep your kid in daycare and things just go on because it's a short stint or whatever it is, you've got some buffer.
Yeah.
And another experience where you really you're pulling your kid out of daycare, and what we've averaged here are 5 hours more and no effect to get 25 minutes. I wonder if there is some sort of distributional analysis that might.
I mean, that's a great suggestion, right? Because also these people are presumably starting out in different places, right? With the amount of time that they're spending. And so, so I mean, like I said, this is kind of the first set of estimates that I've done.
It's a lot.
But yeah, no, I think that's a great idea.
The distribution thing would also help answer Ryan's question, the welfare implications.
Yeah.
I think have to do with whether or not you have these big changes
Right.
in the way the household is run.
Yeah.
And looking at developmental time versus routine.
This is the duration aspect. I'm imagining a husband, a father becomes unemployed, tries to find a job for 4 months, and during that time there's only minimal adjustment of home time, and then segues into a full-time stay-at-home dad. I'm not sure what the possibilities are for looking at that sort of thing, but it would be interesting.
Yeah, so I do have a control for whether they were also not working at the last CPS interview, which would mean that like they probably weren't working for somewhere between a 2 and 5 month period if they're still not working. But it's right now, I don't think it's broken down by unemployed or out of the labor force. I think this sample was getting a little small when I did that, so I combined them. But I agree, I think that's like an important part of the story, right, is whether or not, because in the other analysis with the PSID, the time that you've been unemployed matters. Like for a shorter period of time, things don't seem to change much and they go back to normal. Whereas people who are unemployed longer, there seems to be more of a change. And so, yeah, so that's something that I might be able to look at by pulling a little bit more of the CPS data in. I'd have to see. Yeah.
You have multiple waves in CPS, I mean,
You
get
do.
long-term unemployment.
Yes, exactly, yeah. It's a little complex to make some of the connections, but it can be done, yes.
We should probably stop
Okay,
there. Thank
all
you very
right.
much.